Alright, so I'm going to tell the story of the three identical triplets that were in my senior year math class, and I'm going to talk about one particular period where things really went haywire. So, there were three triplets, and one of their names, I went to school with them last year in high school. So one of their names was Brandon, and then one of their names was Andrew, and another one of their names was Nate. And you know, Brandon, Nate, and Andrew were like 5'5", and they were 5'5", and they were a chatty bunch. What they would do is they would go into the corner of the room. These three triplets would go into the corner of the room and they would talk amongst themselves in a little, I guess you wouldn't call it a circle, you would call it kind of a triangle. They'd put their heads together and they'd start making fun of everybody. People would say, "Hey, Andrew, Brandon, and Matt, what are you doing?" And they'd say, "None of your goddamn business, shove off, you know?" And so this kept happening. So one class period, the Professor Callahan, this was a math class. So Professor Callahan said, "What are you guys talking about?" You know, he was like Scottish. So Professor Callahan said, "What are you guys talking about?" And the triplets, they look up all at once, and they stare at him and they go, "Oh, you know, we have $10." And Professor Callahan goes, "What does that have to do with math?" And then Brandon, Andrew, and Matt and Nate, they go, "It has to do with math because $10 is a number." And then Professor Callahan goes, "Well, this isn't the first grade. This is advanced algebra." So we were in an advanced algebra class, incidentally. Anyway, so what they did was, or what Andrew did was, he rolled a $10 bill up into a ball. He said, "Professor Callahan, look." Professor Callahan said, "Yes, you've crumpled a $10 bill into a ball." And then Andrew was like, "Guess what?" And Professor Callahan was like, "What?" And then Andrew threw the ball at Professor Callahan's face and said, "That's what." Anyway, so Professor Callahan, you know, he sat down next to Andrew and he said, "If I didn't know any better, I would have thought you just disrespected your professor." And Andrew was like, "I did." And he was like, "I don't regret it." And Professor Callahan was like, "Say now we've got ourselves a problem." He said, "I'd hate to get Principal Dillingham on this." Andrew said, "I dare you." And the other two triplets, Matt and Brandon, they stood up and they started poking Professor Callahan all around. Anyway, so Professor Callahan goes, "Oh, I've had enough of this." And what Professor Callahan did was he went to the corner of the classroom and he just started peeing in the corner of the classroom. I remember what I thought at the time was, this is quite bizarre. I thought to myself, why is this happening? Why is my professor peeing in the corner of the classroom? And then Andrew said, that's what you're due, Professor Callahan." He said, "You're behaving like an animal, because you are one." And then Brandon and Nate said, "Yeah, yeah, Professor Callahan, you're like an animal." And then so Professor Callahan kept peeing in the corner of the classroom. I remember one of my like, what is it, co-students, one of my peers, who was a girl who was seated in the corner of the classroom, said, "Oh my," no, she wasn't British. She said, "Oh my gosh, ew, I can't believe Professor Callahan is peeing in the class in the corner of the classroom. And then so, and this was the first time I had ever been in a class like that where the teacher just peed in the classroom. So the Principal Dillinger, came into the classroom. Principal Dillinger said, "All right then, what's the problem?" And they saw Professor Callahan still peeing. It was like 3 minutes of urination. And Principal Dillinger went, "All right then," and he joined Professor Callahan in the urinating. And so, since that day, whenever I'm in that class, I make sure not to sit in those seats. So, what was the message of the story? Well, the message of the story is I guess real life stories don't always have messages. So this is what maybe an example of one of those, because I mean maybe the message, but maybe the message you got to create your own meaning with the story of life as it unfolds. So, and again, the meaning for me was I'm not going to sit in the corner of the classroom, and I'm not going to take people so seriously because I know that sometimes they pee in the classroom in public, and that's just part of life. So anyway, that's it. That was a story about the three triplets, about Brandon, Nate, and Andrew, who were 5'5". Anyway, I guess I actually have. So I'm not gonna title this. I'm gonna title this video "The Story of the Professor That Peed in My Classroom" or something. Anyway, thanks for watching to this true story.